Welcome back to the JDG. This is our final seminar for the Michaelmas term, and we have the pleasure today to be joined by Benjamin Kiesewetter. Benjamin is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Free University of Berlin and is here today with us to present his paper, Tanto Rights and the Duty to Save the Greater Number. Benjamin, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to present in our forum. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invitation and for your interest in coming and perhaps reading the paper, at least discussing it with me. After all, I really look forward to this. So, as Mauricio just said, Pro Tanto Rights and the Duty to Save the Greater Number is the title of this paper. And I'm going to start with explaining a little bit of the background. So one important reference point in recent debates in moral philosophy, moral theory, is the distinction between overall and contributory judgments or concepts, right? Overall normative concepts include the concepts ought, right, wrong, permissible, and the paradigmatic contributory normative concept is the concept of a reason that supports a response only to some extent, pro tanto. And that competes with other factors in determining the overall status of, the overall normative status of an action. And one natural way to think about this is to think of contributory normative concepts as those concepts that appear in the premises of deliberation, practical reasoning, while overall normative concepts appear in the conclusions of practical deliberations. Now, one question that I think hasn't received the attention that it deserves is the question how moral claim rights relate to this distinction between the overall and the contributory. There seem to be two views on this matter. One is rights absolutism. That's a view that's often ascribed to Robert Nozick and then has more explicitly been defended by Russ Schaefer-Landau and more recently by Jay Wallace. That's the view that rights necessarily correlate with overall moral obligations, right? And the contrasting views, rights contribute, what we might call rights contributionism. If you have a better term for that, let me know. It's just for lack of a better term, I call it rights contributionism. That's the view that rights are competing factors that can sometimes be permissibly infringed. It's a view that is pretty explicit in Judith Jarvis Thompson's work on rights and also adopted by Joel Feinberg. So just to illustrate this distinction between the two views, consider a famous example that Joel Feinberg has presented in order to argue for rights contributionism. The example of a backpacker who's hiking through the mountains and who's hit by a life-threatening blizzard. Fortunately, the backpacker finds an unoccupied cabin, which is locked, so it's clearly somebody else's property. The backpacker breaks into the cabin, stays in there for 3 days to survive the blizzard. So very few would deny that the backpacker here acts morally impermissible, right? Acts morally permissible. So very few would say that that was impermissible. But the two views I'm interested in, they disagree about whether the backpacker violated or infringed a right, right? The rights contributionists say, look, there was a right of the owner of the cabin against unauthorized use of his cabin. And that right was infringed by the backpacker, even though it was permissibly infringed. While rights absolutists say, no, there wasn't really a right of the owner, a moral right, at least not a moral right, against the backpacker against using the cabin under these particular life-threatening circumstances. Okay. So that's the dispute that I'm concerned with today. And my aims in this talk are to, and in the paper that I've sent around, are first to argue for rights contributions. I want to present an argument for this view. And then I also want to show that rights contribution is relevant, right? I want to show that it offers, clears the way for a certain kind of distinctively deontological vindication of the view that we ought to save the greater number in so-called toric cases, right? In cases in which we can choose between saving either a smaller or a greater number of people. So let's start with the argument right away. So the basic point that I want to make is that there is a distinctive normative structure that occurs on the contributory level, on the pro-tanto level. And this structure cannot be identified just with a standard moral reason. And it's very characteristic of a right-duty nexus. And the example that I'm going to use to illustrate that structure is the example of a promissory reason, of a reason that someone, I call him Alan, has because he promised some action. So suppose Alan promised Thelma to meet her for lunch, and because of that, he has a reason to meet her for lunch, right? Here's Alan. So the point that I want to make is that this reason, the promissory reason, has a number of interesting features that are characteristic of rights. Here's a list of these features. So the reason seems to be directed in the sense that conformity with this reason is owed to another person, right? Thelma, the conformity with the promissory reason is owed to Thelma in this case. The reason seems, secondly, repair related, related to moral repair. So non-conformity with this reason calls for apology and compensation for incurred costs. The reason, third, seems preemptive in the sense that it is protected from being outweighed by certain other reasons, including standard welfarist reasons. So if you think of reasons to do pleasurable things or reasons to do others a favor, it seems that these are the wrong kind of reasons to be ever able to outweigh a promissory reason. So these reasons seem in some sense to be excluded from deliberation, and they seem incapable of outweighing a promissory reason. That is the sense in which the promissory reason preempts such reasons. The fourth feature is peremptoriness. The reason makes the action morally required in the absence of sufficient competing reasons. That seems to be the case here, right? If you've given a promise and you have no sufficient reason to break that promise, then you have an obligation. You're morally required to keep the promise. Fifth, the reason seems waivable. It can be cancelled by declaration. So Thelma has a power to say, look, I release you from the promise, and thereby she cancels the reason to keep that promise. And sixth, the reason is voluntary. That's also a special feature here. It exists as a result of a voluntary transaction. Now, my thesis is that these features are distinctive for only a certain kind of subset of moral reasons. They're not general properties of moral reasons, and they are characteristic of rights. And third, they occur on the contributory level, on the pro-tanto level. So to see why I think that distinctive for only some moral reasons, just consider a case in which Alan has a reason to meet Thelma for lunch, not because he promised to do that, but because that would make Thelma happy, say, right? That it would make Thelma happy to do something is moral reason to do it. But that doesn't seem to be a reason that is directed in the sense that it is owed, that Alan owes this action to Thelma. It's not that this reason calls, like non-conformity with this reason doesn't call for apology or compensation. The reason doesn't seem to be protected from being outweighed in the sense which I have described, right? It seems perfectly fine to weigh this reason against other reasons to do other people a favor or to do pleasurable things, for example. It doesn't seem to be peremptory, because even in the absence of sufficient reasons for doing something else, the action doesn't seem to be morally required. It rather seems to be supererogatory. The reason isn't waivable, it can't be cancelled by declaration, and it also isn't voluntary. Okay. So these features are really distinctive features of a certain class of moral reasons. They're not general, universal features of moral reasons. And they are all characteristic for rights, by which I mean they are essential features of at least some rights, right? So I think that the first four features are really necessary features of all rights, since all rights entail directed duties, and therefore they're all directed, right? They're all repair related, they're all preemptive, I think, because it seems to be characteristic of rights that rights are somehow protected from being outweighed in standard ways, and they're all peremptory because like satisfying a right is never supererogatory. Waivability is more controversial. Of course, there are theories of rights which say that all rights are waivable, but I don't want to assume that this is true, but it seems at least, I think, pretty uncontroversial that it's at least an essential feature of many rights that they are waivable. And it's also clearly not a necessary feature, but an essential feature of some rights that they are voluntary, that can be the result of voluntary transactions like contracts or things like that. Okay. So let's have a look at my third claim here, that these features, so I've argued that these features are distinctive for some moral reasons, that they are characteristic of rights, and now I'm going to argue that they occur on the contributory level, right? So to illustrate this, just suppose that Alan's reason to keep his promise to Belma is defeated by stronger moral reasons. Think of a duty of care, right? Alan has kids, his kid falls ill, he has to take care of his kid, he can't reach Belma, so he has to break his promise, all things considered. Now, that the reason to keep his promise is overridden or outweighed doesn't mean that it's cancelled, right? He still has a pro tanto reason to keep his promise. And this reason still has all these features. It's directed towards Belma. It still makes apology and compensation appropriate. It's still protected from countervailing defeat by standard welfarist reasons. It still makes the action required in the absence of competitors. It's still waivable. So even an outweighed reason can be cancelled by declaration. So if Belma hears from that situation, she still can say, look, I release you from that promise, thereby making it the case that a reason that was outweighed is no longer a reason at all. And the reason is, of course, still voluntary. Okay. So all these features occur on the pro tanto level. And this, I think, gives rise to something like an abductive argument for rights contribution. It's an abductive argument, an inference to the best explanation. The first premise is that some moral reasons have distinctive features that are characteristic of rights. I've argued for this premise. The second premise is that this is best explained by a view that takes these reasons to correspond with rights. So first that moral reasons, that some moral reasons have these features, is somehow calls for an explanation. And it seems that a view that takes these reasons to correspond with rights does very well in providing such an explanation. So this view might be one in which the reasons and questions are provided by rights or grounded in rights. It might also be one in which the rights are kind of constituted by these special reasons. So I don't want to make a claim about the metaphysical priority between rights and reasons here. Either of these ways would say, look, the kind of reasons that have these distinctive features, they correspond with rights. And that's all I need here for the argument, that the best explanation for this first premise is that is provided by a view that according to which these reasons correspond with rights. I've shown that the reasons have the relevant features, even in case they are defeated by stronger reasons. And so we can conclude that there can be stronger moral reasons for infringing a right. And that's just the view, the right contributionism view. Right. Now, this is the argument that I wanted to present. And so before moving on to the second part of the paper, just let me present maybe one worry that you might have with the argument. And that is that I haven't shown that there are no absolute rights. Of course, I've only shown that there are contributory rights or pro tanto rights. And so you might worry why the rights absolutists couldn't just use the term right, but to refer to absolute rights and use some other term like the term claim, for example, for contributory rights. And this seems to be something that some authors choose to speak in this way, right? They distinguish between rights and claims and use rights for absolute rights and claims for contributory rights. And of course, I don't mind this terminological choice. It can be helpful or whatever. But I want to point out that this view is just a terminological variant, really, of rights contributionism. The substantive point I've argued for remains in force, right? That's the substantive point, is that there is a distinctive normative structure on the contributory level, which cannot be identified with a moral reason, and which very much looks like and has the features that we usually ascribe to rights. Okay? And this substantive point, no matter whether we in the end want to call these things rights or claims, but this substantive point has, I think, important upshots for moral theorizing, and those upshots are those that I want to address now. In the second part of this presentation, I'm going to focus here on one upshot, namely Tory cases, which are kind of cases in which we face a certain kind of dilemma between saving two different groups of people, and one of these groups contains a greater number of people. Okay. So one famous case is a case in which like somebody owns like 5 pills and can save 5 people with these pills, giving 5 people each one pill. All these people have a terminal disease and they will otherwise die. And she can give each of them 1 pill, or she can decide to give the 5 pills to a 6th person who needs all the 5 pills in order to survive, right? And many people in such cases say that there is at least ceteris paribus a duty to save the greater number, to go for the option of saving the greater number. That's we might call the principle of saving the greater number. Other things equal, A has a duty to save the greater number. Other things equal means we abstract away from things like, for example, life expectancy or relational duties that we might have towards specific persons here. But if we abstract away from such factors, we should save the greater number. Many people say, I mean, that's not uncontroversial, of course. Torek himself has denied famously this principle, but I think it's fair at least to say that it has prima facie plausibility, this principle. And now, famously, of course, consequentialists have no problem in defending this principle. Consequentialism, at least standard consequentialism, demands to maximize aggregated welfare. And that's just what the principle of saving the greater number tells us to do in such cases. So there's no problem for consequentialism here. But it's not so easily vindicated by deontologists, because deontologists typically hold that there are limits to, at least limits to interpersonal aggregation, and that interpersonal aggregation is impermissible in many cases. And the famous case here is, of course, in Judy Thompson's transplant case, in which a surgeon has the option of stealing or harvesting the organs of a healthy patient and distributing the organs to like 5 seriously ill patients who would otherwise die and would then survive because they get this kind of organ. So doing this, harvesting the 5 organs from the healthy person would maximize aggregated welfare. So in the end, we would have 5 people survive rather than 1. So this maximizes aggregated welfare. But deontologists famously think that that's impermissible. That's one of like the most intuitive arguments maybe against standard consequentialism, that it seems to license this kind of action, which seems impermissible. So it's unclear how deontologists can say that interpersonal welfare aggregation is impermissible in cases like the transplant case, while at the same time saying that we should aggregate in Tory cases. And deontologists who have defended something like the principle of saving the greater number, like Scanlon or Ken, they've been charged with relying on assumptions of welfare aggregation that they are committed to denying, or that are at least in tension with their deontological commitments. Now, my thesis is that there is a plausible and distinctively deontological vindication of this principle, the principle of saving the greater number, which appeals to the assumption that in Tory cases, every person in need of help has a right to being saved, a pro tanto right, which has to be weighed against conflicting rights. Okay, that's the basic idea here. So if you're a rights contributionist, you can say that everyone has a right to being saved, and that, I think, can vindicate the principle of saving the greater number. How does it look like? Very briefly, I want to assume something like a reasons aggregation principle, which tells us that if 2 reasons provide independent support for a response, then the combined support for this response is stronger than the support that each reason provides individually, right? Unless this is prevented by something, okay? So this kind of combination of forces of reasons can be prevented, but it's the default assumption we should have, that reasons aggregate. We need an explanation if for non-aggregation, so to speak. Right? A couple of remarks on this. This seems to me an assumption about the logic of reasons quite generally. So, for example, it seems to be true about epistemic reasons, about reasons for emotions, which have nothing to do with debates in normative ethics. So we shouldn't be suspicious that this is something like a consequentialist principle or something like that. One possible deontological view compatible with this principle is that aggregation is prevented whenever reasons are based in different people's welfare. Okay, that would, of course, give us the reason that would give us a view according to which we're never allowed to aggregate reasons when they're based in different people's welfare. So also not in Tory cases. But I just want to point out that this might be just unnecessarily strong, right? And I think a better view is to say that aggregation is prevented by rights. Okay? And so the idea here is that rights entail, as we've already seen, something like a preemptive reason, a reason that is protected from being outweighed by certain other considerations. And my proposal is that part of what this means to be protected by being outweighed is that they involve something like a ban on aggregation. Okay, so preemptive reasons prevent weaker or certain kind of weaker competing reasons from aggregating and thus outweighing the preemptive reasons in combination, okay? So preemptive reasons are preventer of aggregation. And a good example is, I think, the right to one's organs and the transplant case. So I think we want to say that persons have a right to their own organs, and that means that there's a preemptive reasons against others not to take away their organs, right, against their without their consent or something. And this reason is preemptive in the sense that no number of beneficiaries, of organ beneficiaries, can kind of outweigh this reason, this preemptive reasons not to steal the organs. Now, this seems to me a distinctively deontological or non-consequentialist idea. This idea that rights involve preemptive reasons that involve a ban on aggregation, and one that is compatible with this kind of reasons aggregation principle, which is again to stress the point that the reasons aggregation principle is not itself a consequentialist principle or something like that. Now, let's turn to the deontological defense of the principle of saving the greater number that I have in mind. So I want to assume that everyone has a pro tanto right against the agent A to being saved. This entails a preemptive reason for A to save her, right? This reason is preemptive, so it's protected from being outweighed by certain other reasons. And this involves, according to my proposal, a ban on aggregating these other reasons. But here's the important point: reasons generally cannot preempt reasons of the same kind and strength, okay? So preemption is asymmetric, right? Preemption involves like winning the competition or something like that. So reasons cannot be preemptive with regard to reasons that are of the same kind and strength, okay? And this means that this kind of ban on aggregation cannot apply to other preemptive reasons for saving. So the reasons that are of the same kind and strength are preemptive, but they're preemptive with regard to other considerations. And there's no ban on aggregation of these reasons for saving. So the reasons aggregate according to the reasons aggregation principle, and they just aggregate because nothing prevents them from aggregating. There's no explanation of why they shouldn't aggregate. Okay, but still, this approach is distinctively deontological, I want to insist, because it involves a right that is preemptive and involves a ban on aggregating certain other reasons. And in particular, it yields the approach still yields a ban on interpersonal aggregation in the cases in which we want such a ban, such as in the transplant case. That's the idea, just a very brief sum up of the main claims. So in the first part, I've tried to argue that certain contributory reasons have distinctive features that are characteristic of rights, and that the best explanation of this fact entails that rights are contributory. And in the second part, I've tried to illustrate that the recognition of such contributory rights clears the way for particularly deontological vindication of the duty to save the greater number in tort cases. Thank you very much for your patience and attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.